I know I'm all over the place with this camera or my phone. Trying to avoid the window that's right behind me with lots of light. So anyway, let me see this. So we're talking about the Road to Little Dribbling, Adventures of an American in Britain by Bill Bryson. Oops, sorry. I brought the book, and I thought that what I would do is I'm gonna do several readings from this book, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about my story. I became a Britophile at a very young age, and I was probably in 6th grade with Sister Leopold, and we were studying the Crusades, and for extra credit she gave me time to draw things like castles and knights and things like that, and I got very interested in England. And that just grew and grew. Of course, I'm old enough to be a I should say a Beatle fan. And so a lot happened in those 4 years of crazy high school. And I need to make a confession in that as I've gotten older, and over the years, I have gotten to the point where I watch almost exclusively British films, British series, British comedy shows. I love British authors. I listen to so much from the British that I'm surprised I don't have a British accent. So by now, but if I read, and this is going to be tricky to read on camera, trying to hold my phone at the same time. If I have any mispronunciations, and there are any British people that are following this book sandwiched in, I apologize in advance. I got a surprise in the mail. It was after I got hit by a car walking out of the grocery store. And one of my high school friends, her name is Kathy Kelly Sprisler. She is also a fellow Britophile. And she had seen me post my pathetic things on Facebook about my accident. And she sent me this wonderful book to read that had a lot of laughs, because laughter is healing, and she loves to laugh. And I have to say, Kathy is an author herself. She's written 3 books that are very, very, very entertaining and very funny, but I think they're out of print. So I know that I'm not alone in my obsession with this, but Kathy sent me the book. I was very surprised, The Road to Little Dribbling. And I have to confess that I did know about Bill Bryson, sort of, but, oh, that's my Twitter. I've got my Twitter profile up, and you'll see, if you can read it, it says that I'm an American Britophile. So I knew a little bit about Bill Bryson. I didn't know that he had written, so far, he's written 18 books at least. He was born in Des Moines, Iowa, and grew up there. And when he went to college, he dropped out of college and did what lots of guys did back then. He got a backpack, and he backpacked through Europe and went to England. Somewhere along the way, he also worked for a lot of newspapers, and he ended up going back to Britain. I believe when he was on his backpacking tour, he met a girl and became his wife. And they have been living in England for probably at least now 25 to 30 years. He wrote his book, Notes from a Small Island, which was about walking around and touring places in Britain. And that became actually a television series in Britain. And more recently, his book, A Walk in the Woods, it's called Rediscovering America on the Appalachian Trail, was made into a movie, which I haven't seen yet, but I really want to see it now that I know that's his book. Oh wait, there's more. He's, over his career, been named Chancellor of Durham University in England. He's the winner of the James Joyce Award by the Literary and Historical Society of the University College of Dublin. And one of his later books, Short History of Nearly Everything, won the Descartes Prize for Science Communication. So he's very interested, and this is a book that was very hailed with great praise from the scientific community. He's very interested in science and the outdoors. So how this all started, and this is where it's going to get kind of hard, because I wanted to read you a piece when it started out. He says, and there's that window in back of me, forgive me. I first came to England at the end of my life when I was still quite young, just 20. At the other end of my life, whoops, when I was still quite young, just 20. In those days, for a short but intensive period, a very high proportion of all in the world that was worth taking note of came out of Britain. The Beatles, James Bond, Mary Quant in miniskirts, Twiggy, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor's love life, Princess Margaret's love life, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, suit jackets without collars, television series like The Avengers and The Prisoner, spy novels by John le Carre and Len Dayton, Marianne Faithfull, Petula Clark, Dusty Springfield, quirky movies starring David Hemmings and Terrence Stamp that we didn't quite get in Iowa, and I have to say we didn't quite get them in Rochester either. Harold Pinter plays that we didn't get at all. Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, that was the week that was, the perfume scandal, practically everything really. So he goes on to say, my time, he said, I'm constantly at loss in this new world because Britain has changed so much. This is me saying this. Britain has changed so much that he had changed a lot since Notes from a Small Island. So he feels like he's becoming a stranger, even though he also at the same time is becoming a citizen in Britain. So now he has actually dual citizenship. He said, I'm constantly at loss in this new world. Recently, I closed my door on a caller because I couldn't think of what else to do with him. He was a meter reader. At first, I was pleased to see him. We haven't had a meter reader in our house since Edward Heath was prime minister, so I let him in gladly and even fetched a stepladder so he could climb up and get the clear reading. It was only when he departed and returned a minute later that I began to regret our deepening relationship. Sorry, I also need to read the meter in the men's room, he told me. I beg your pardon? It says here there's a second meter in the men's room. Well, we don't have a men's room because this is a house, you see. It says here it's a school. Well, it's not. It's a house. You were just in it. Did you see rooms full of young people? He thought hard for a minute. Do you mind if I have a look around? I beg your pardon? Just a little look. Won't take 5 minutes. You think you're going to find a men's room that we have somehow overlooked? You never know, he said brightly. I'm shutting the door now because I don't know what else to do, I said, and shut the door. I could hear him making mild bleating through the wood. Besides, I have an important appointment, I called back through the wood. And it was true. I did have an important appointment, one, as it happens, that had everything to do with the book that follows. I was going to Eastleigh to take the British citizenship test. The irony of this was not lost on me. Just as I was becoming thoroughly remystified by life in modern Britain, I was being summoned to demonstrate that I understood the place. So after his test, which he describes with great humor, and I have to say that this book is full of history. It's full of things about travel, but it's also very, very, very funny, just in the way that he writes things. And there were some parts that I thought about reading, but he also has quite a, well, you know, he swears sometimes. So Bryson had met with his agent, and when they were having lunch, he said, "Did you know that it's been 20 or 25 years since Notes from a Small Island came out?" And of course, Bryson was like, "Oh my God, how does this happen? How does time fly so much?" So his agent gently proposed that perhaps he would like to revisit and take another trip and see what had changed and what hadn't. So that's what this book, which is about 390 some pages long, is about. So this is what he says about traveling throughout Britain. And the Bryson Trail. For the briefest of time or periods, I considered the possibility of traveling through Britain along my newly discovered line, the Bryson line, as I would like it now to become generally known, since I was the one who discovered it. But I could see almost at once that wouldn't be practical or even desirable. It would mean, if I took it literally, going through people's houses and yards, tramping across trackless fields, fording rivers, which was clearly crazy. And if I just tried to stay close to it, it would mean endlessly picking my way through suburban streets in places like Macclesfield and Wolverhampton, which didn't sound terribly rewarding either. But I could certainly use the Bryson line as a kind of beacon to guide my way. I determined that I would begin and end at its terminal points and visit from time to time en route when I conveniently could, and when I remembered to do so, but I wouldn't force myself to follow it religiously. It would be rather my terminus ad quem, whatever exactly that means. Along the way, I would, as far as possible, avoid the places I went on the first trip. Too much danger of standing on a corner and harumphing at how things had deteriorated since I was last there, and instead focus on places I had never been, in the hope I could see them with fresh, unbiased eyes. I particularly liked the idea of Cape Wrath. I know nothing about it. It could be a caravan park for all I know, but it sounded rugged and wave-battered and difficult to get to, a destination for a serious traveler. When people asked me where I was bound, I would gaze toward the northern horizon with a set expression and say, "Cape Wrath, God willing." I imagine my listeners give a low whistle of admiration and replying, "Gosh, that's a long way." And I would nod in agreement, grim acknowledgement. Not even sure if there's a tea room, I would add. But before that distant adventure, I had hundreds of miles of historic towns and lovely countryside to get through, and a visit to the celebrated English seaside at Bognor. Now, if we look at the Bryson Trail slide, you can see there's Bognor Regis. I'm going to turn this around for just a second. Let's see. I can't do that. I can't do it on. Anyway, if you look at the slide, which I'm sure Alexis has up, Bognor Regis is at the very bottom of England, around Brighton and Hove. And so he decided to start there. And one of the things that in this book, it showed that there were things that had really changed in modern England today that he's not very happy with. But so this chapter 1 is called Bognor. Before I went there for the first time, about all I knew about Bognor Regis, beyond how to spell it, was that some British monarch at some uncertain point in the past, in a moment of deathbed acerbity, called out the words "Bugger Bognor" just before expiring, though which monarch it was and why his parting wish on earth was to see a medium-sized English coastal resort sodomized are questions I could not answer. The monarch I've since learned was George V, and the story is that in 1929, he traveled to Bognor on the advice of his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, who proposed that a spell of fresh sea air might help him recover from a serious lung complaint. That Dawson could think of no better treatment than a change of scene is perhaps a reflection of his most outstanding characteristic as a doctor, incompetence. Dawson was in fact so celebrated for medical ineptitude that a ditty was composed in his honor, and it went, "Lord Dawson of Penn has killed lots of men, so that's why we sing, God Save the King." The king chose Bognor, not because he held any especial affection for it, but because a rich chum of his, named Sir Arthur de Cross, had a mansion there called Craigwheel House, which he offered to the king for his private use. Craigwheel was by all accounts an ugly and uncomfortable retreat, and the king liked nothing about it. But the sea air did do him good, and after a few months, he was well enough to return to London. If he left with any fond memories of Bognor, he didn't relate them. 6 years later, when the king relapsed and now lay dying, Dawson blandly assured him that soon he would be well enough to return to Bognor for another holiday. "Bugger Bognor," the king reportedly said, and thereupon died. The story is nearly always dismissed as fiction, but one of George V's biographers, Kenneth Rose, maintains that it could be true, and it certainly would not have been out of character. Because of the king's short residency, Bognor petitioned to have the word Regis added to its title, and in 1929, this was granted, so that, interestingly, its supreme elevation and onset of terminal decline date from almost precisely that same moment. I think about Lyme Regis. It's somewhere on that was where they, the scene of French Lieutenant's Woman. And so now I know why it's called Lyme Regis, because apparently a king stayed there for a while. So there's about 2,000 different places that I wanted to read about, but I highly recommend that you read the book, or if you haven't, if you have, really enjoy all his descriptions. You have to read this. I have to. This actually is a chapter about the Seven Sisters, but this is perfect. Every time I read this, literally, I laugh. Some woman I have never met regularly sends me email alerts telling me how to recognize if I'm having a stroke. If you feel a tingling in your fingers, one will say, you could be having a stroke. Seek medical attention at once. The alerts come with a lot of italics and abrupt capitalizations, presumably to underline how serious a matter this is. Another will say, if you sometimes can't remember where you parked your car in a big parking lot, you are probably having a stroke. Go to an emergency room immediately. The uncanny thing about these messages is how accurately they apply to me. I have every one of the symptoms, and there are hundreds of them. Every couple of days, I learn a new one. If you think you might be producing more earwax than normal, if you sometimes sneeze unexpectedly, if you have had toast at any time in the last 6 months, if you celebrate your birthday on the same day every year, if you feel anxious about strokes after reading stroke warnings, if you have any of these symptoms or any other symptoms, find a doctor at once. An embolism the size of a duck egg is heading straight for your cerebral cortex. So, actually, he began talking about the Seven Sisters, which are a series of great hills and cliffs, and Dover is part of the Seven Sisters. He said, unnerved by my dossier of stroke warnings, I did some research, and it appears that there are two fundamental ways of having a stroke. One is to die of something else first, or to avoid having a stroke. One is to die of something else first. The other is to get some exercise. I decided, in the interest of survival, to introduce a little walking into my life. And so it was the day after my trip from Bognor to Hove that I was found to be 15 or so miles to the east, wheezing my way up a steep hill to a breezy top called Haven Brow, the first in a series of celebrated eminences gracing the Sussex coast and known as the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters is one of the great walks in England. From the top of Haven Brow, the view is just sensational. Ahead of you stretches a hazy infinity of rolling hills, each ending at the seaward stretches as the seaward side in a sudden plunge of limestone cliffs. On a sunny day like this one, it is a world of simple, bright elements: green land, brilliant white cliffs, deep blue matching sky. So we have the Bryson Sail. There is Sussex, just because it's pretty. I put that in. But and also to show how most of what he's looking for are those very kinds of walks and the beauty of the British countryside when it hasn't been over commercialized by big box stores. You know, when you think about it, I don't think about them, the Brits, having big box stores and just a general industrialization that and commercialization that has taken over in many parts of the places that Bryson first walked. And he didn't want to see those again. He didn't want to know that they had been not destroyed, but diminished, let's say. So, and it's not that much of the book is along that line, but he does compare what he's seeing for instance, in the gorgeous British countryside to what he sees, the kind of the downfall and the decline of certain villages and places that have empty storefronts or something like that. But plenty of this book has to do with the gorgeousness of the country that he loves and he's exploring. So we'll move on to East Anglia in Norfolk. I think, and I could be wrong, please someone correct me if I am wrong, that is where William and Catherine were stationed when he was with the helicopter rescue, or else it was on the other side of the country and it was in Wales. I can't remember, but it sounds familiar. Anyway, so I love I love writers that can very subtly incorporate humor through their words into their writing. It's so subtle, and I find it mostly with British writers, but that could be because I'm not reading a lot of American writers. Anyway, this is um, this is what he has to say about Norfolk. Now we've really skipped over. Let's see, we've skipped over London, and we've skipped over Dover, and a national park. It looks like forests beside the seaside. I'm not saying where these places are. Well, he has day trips that he's taken, and then going to the west, Devon, Cornwall, which he was not happy about because of the traffic to Cornwall. Tourism has taken over there. Anyway, so we're going to East Anglia on the other side, and facing what I believe is the North Sea. He said, on a lovely bright summer's morning, I was walking the Norfolk coast path between Holcombe and Blakeney when I came around a bend and found the way temporarily blocked by a woman and her dog. I stood with the woman and we watched together as the dog dolefully extruded 3 soft lozenges onto the path. You know, at first, when I read that, I thought the dog was throwing up. So, okay, but no. What a great way to describe what he was doing. So, don't you think that's a little disgusting right there on the path and all? I asked in a tone of genuine inquiry. I'm local, she said, as if that explained everything. She was well spoken. And that gives you the right to let your dog shit on the pads? I'm going to cover it, she said irritably, as if I were needlessly belaboring the point. Look, she said, and scuffed some leaf litters over it, converting the dog's deposit from a conspicuous hazard into a kind of fecal landmine. There, she said, and looked at me with satisfaction as if this had solved everything. I stared at her for a moment, with something like awe, then raised my walking stick high into the air and calmly beat her to death. When she was quite still, I rolled her ample, barber-clad body off the path and into the marshy reeds where it sank with a satisfying glug. Then I checked my map and resumed my walk, wondering if there was any place in Blakeney where I could get a cup of tea at this hour. You didn't really do that. Of course, we know that, but I like Norfolk. I lived there for 10 years until 2013 and have grown convinced that there's nothing wrong with it, that a few hills and a little genetic variability wouldn't fix. For the benefit of the foreign reader, I should perhaps explain that Norfolk has a long-standing reputation for inbreeding. As my son Sam used to say, Norfolk, too many people, not enough surnames. I am not for a moment suggesting that the rumors are entirely true, but I will say that when the police do DNA checks after crimes, they sometimes have to arrest as many as 12,000 people. He says, the other thing for which Norfolk is famed incontestably is flatness. Much of it makes tabletops look varied and interesting. There are some so it's very easy walking is what he's talking about. And he can walk for miles and miles and miles. See, I have something marked here. Oh. I stayed the night in the Burlington Hotel, a large and dark establishment on the seafront for which I have an unaccountable affection. I've never been in the Burlington when I didn't wonder if I was the only guest in the place, but somehow it hangs in there. Perhaps my semi-annual visits are all the business that they need. While grooming for the evening, I turned on the television just in time for the local news, which in this part of the world is always means a factory closure in Lowestoft. I am amazed that there are any factories left to close in Lowestoft, because they always seem to find another one. It's generally an obscure business that's the last of its type in Brittany. Britain's last remaining kelp sniffers to close its doors after 160 years, the newsreader will gravely intone. 250 employees, some of whom have been in with the firm since the 19th century, are to lose their jobs. The next night, it will be Britain's last remaining cockle flayer, flange trimmer, oyster chafer, or some other improbable enterprise. Staff have been offered alternative employment at the company's production facility in Ho Chi Minh City. So it turns out that I'm not really reading you a lot of the pretty stuff, but we're getting to Cape Wrath. He says, there are two hard things about getting to Cape Wrath from the south of England. The first is getting to Cape Wrath from the south of England. It's a long way, you see, 700 miles from my back door, according to Google Maps, and involves at a minimum a train journey, a car journey, a ferry trip across the lonely Isle of Durness, and a bouncy ride in a minibus through uninhabited wilderness. So it takes some logics to work out. The second and even more unsettling part of the undertaking is determining whether you can get there at all. The Cape Wrath website stresses that ferry crossings are subject to the vagrancy of tides and weather, which in this part of Scotland can be both disruptive and extreme. So this is one of the, pretty much the last part, obviously, because we're all the way, let's see, I'm all the way at the very end of the book. And he has a particularly lovely thing about Scotland in general, and just riding on the train and looking at all the beautiful wild scenery, and the old train that he's in where he has a berth, and they bring him a hot breakfast. It's not the nicest train in the world, but he gets to Cape Wrath and has a wonderful trip, just kind of rolling around Scotland for a bit in the Highlands, and more or less closes out. But the question is, what about Little Dribbling? And my answer is, you have to write a book to find out where the road is to Little Dribbling. So with that long part of reading to you, for those of you who are still awake, I just wondered if you have any questions. And I don't know if will I see? There we go.
So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or there is that raise your hand feature where you can ask them verbally, and I will allow you to speak.
They're all asleep.
No. It looks like we do have one.
Okay. What's your favorite place in the UK? Okay, here's my other confession. I've only spent one day in England, and that was back when I was 18 years old, and I was in between plane flights for, I think we had 2 days. So we took a very quick walking tour, my mom and myself, and then we met up with my high school pen pal who came from Newcastle upon Tyne, and she and her mother and her best friend had taken a train, an overnight train from Newcastle to get to London. Whoops, sorry, I dropped you. So I did see some of the big sights in London, and we were exhausted. We went into a tea room. I remember a particularly dry ham sandwich that I had. The other times I've been there have been to the airports to change planes. And I'm so sad about that because it's been my dream to kind of do what Bill Bryson did, which was to go from the bottom of England to the top of Scotland. So this is my, maybe why I love this book so much, is that it's sort of taking on my dream trip. Although I have seen so many series um, of England and movies, that I would say that I would like to see Yorkshire. And Cumbria is also quite beautiful. And I'm getting that mainly from people that I have become friends with on Facebook or Twitter. There's some shepherds that have some wonderful social media sites, and just they put up a lot of pictures. It looks a lot like what it's like here in Canandaigua, which is it's very, very cold, very windy. They get snow, but it is also very beautiful. Yes, when travel's allowed again. Oh,
And then it looks like Elaine has a question. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, yes. I love Bill Bryson. I've read 5 or 6 of his books. And so I wonder, was this, what year was this written? Just recently, I assume.
oh gosh. I'd have to look up let me see, I have the book right here. Trying to find the publisher's page. It was written in 2015.
Okay, yeah, well, I'll have to try to find it.
And then I believe I have a few copies that should be on hold so that you should be able to find it at the front desk when you come into the library.
Good.
Oops, what did I do? No.
Nope, you're fine. We can see.
Okay. I think I saw Mary Ann Dennison's name come up at some point. So if
did anyone else want to talk or have any questions? If you did want to say something, please feel free to use the raise hand feature, and or you can direct it into the chat.
anyone? Yeah, I would like to very much like to read. Well, I'd like to read Notes from a Small Island, and a couple of other. I'd like to read A Walk in the Woods, because it's it's an American coming back to America, and kind of seeing it with double vision in a way. From his British standpoint and his American standpoint.
And it looks like Elaine has another comment.
Yeah, Walk in the Woods was his first book, wasn't it?
I don't think so.
Oh, that's the first one I read, so.
Yeah. Again, it's like, let me see here. He has, there was one he wrote, Neither Here Nor There, that I believe he wrote when he was out of college and first working in Britain.
Okay.
The thing they have listed is on the top by Bill Bryson is The Last Continent.
Oh, is that the one about Australia?
It could be.
That was a great book too.
Yeah. He's also written some things like Bill Bryson or Bryson's Dictionary of Troublesome Words. And Bryson's Dictionary for Writers and Editors.
It looks like you have another another comment from Candace saying that he lived in England for 2 years, or that, no, she lived in England for 2 years and loved
Oh,
it,
yeah.
and that you could
Uh,
organize a tea when everyone can gather safely.
Yes, that would be wonderful. I know our curator here at the museum, she went to school there, actually went to high school. Her dad was a professor, I believe. And so she lived there for, I don't know, something like 6 years, and then did her year abroad at Durham University, which is where Bill Bryson was made chancellor for a few years at Durham. And she loved it, and she and her daughter had planned on taking a trip this past summer, the two of them. They've done it before. Her daughter was over there studying as well at one point. And I can't imagine not loving it. But that would be so wonderful.
And I just want to put out, if anyone has any other questions or comments, they can feel free to use the chat or the raise hand feature. And if not, I just wanted to thank everyone for kind of bearing with us today with the technology stuff, and to be present for this presentation today. And I wanted to thank you, Marci, for presenting on Bill Bryson and sharing your love of his work. It looks like everyone says thank you so much, and that it's been brilliant, and
Thank you.
they appreciate you being here today.
Well, I appreciate being asked.
Yep.
I, love to do it again, not necessarily on a British book, but and hopefully I don't know what's wrong. There's something wrong with the camera, because that we have for our computer here, because it's a PC, so you have to have a separate camera that you mount on it to
No worries. Technology things happen.
a really nice camera too.
It's Zoom.
Yeah.
But thank you again. Thanks everyone for being here today, and you did wonderfully. And I
Thank
hope
you.
everyone has a great Monday, and that they tune in again to another book sandwich night.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.